Welcome to the L&D Go Beyond podcast. This is the show that brings you real, actionable workplace learning insights from some of the brightest minds in the L&D space. This season, we're diving into the realm of learning impact. Join experts as they share their knowledge and experiences, helping us push the boundaries of what's possible when it comes to delivering impactful learning. Get ready to go beyond. Enjoy the conversation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of the L&D Go Beyond podcast, where we gather insights from experts to help L&D teams truly go beyond. As you know, in this season, we are focusing on learning impact. And today we have someone who's an expert in creating impactful learning, Christy Tucker. And we are going to talk about scenario-based learning for learning impact. Hi, Christy. Welcome to the L&D Go Beyond podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me here.
Excellent. I'm so glad that you're here. Christy, let me take a moment and introduce you to our audience. Christy Tucker is a learning experience design consultant with over 20 years of experience helping people learn. She specializes in using scenario-based learning to engage audiences and promote skill transfer to real-world environments. She has created training for a wide range of clients, including Fortune 500 companies, nonprofit associations, state and local government agencies, universities, and more. Christy has been blogging about instructional design and e-learning for over 15 years and is a regular speaker at industry conferences and events. So again, Christy, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm looking forward to having a good conversation about scenario-based learning with you.
Absolutely. So am I. I'm looking forward to learning from you today about scenario-based learning and how to do it well. All right. So if we can get started with just understanding how you define scenario-based learning, what does it mean to you? And also, if I may add, are there types of scenario-based learning? People may refer to them by different names, or maybe there are varieties, which is sometimes important to distinguish between.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a good way to start the conversation because definitions in the instructional design field do tend to be pretty squishy. We aren't very consistent about how we use our terms. And so I tend to use scenario-based learning as the big umbrella for any type of learning and training that uses scenarios and stories and simulations and as a big umbrella under which there are several variations. So branching scenarios tend to be the type of scenario-based learning that lots of people think of first. And I love branching scenarios. They're lots of fun, but they aren't the right solution for everything, of course. Nothing is the right answer for everything. I also definitely do mini scenarios, sort of one question, short scenarios. I think that there are also simulations, and I would view simulations generally as you are somehow simulating an environment, generally meaning kind of a step beyond just the branching scenarios where you're doing variables to control different elements of the environment, sometimes with some element of randomization of does something happen this way, or at least it's something where perhaps you're trading off a set of variables. So like a project management simulation where you are looking at the effects of time and cost and scope and quality, and pushing on one of those variables affects another variable. It can be structurally largely a branching scenario, but I think that kind of steps beyond a little bit to a simulation. I think that gamification can be elements in a lot of those, especially the more complex ones. But I think that that's a separate element. You can have a simulation that's pretty serious and not necessarily gamified, especially, doesn't necessarily have points and things, but if we look at game design in terms of the elements of games that are compelling, like a good narrative, having players have control, having players do actions that affect something that happens, then any sort of branching scenario, any sort of interactive scenario does have elements of games. There's always pieces of game design that I think we take in it, even if I wouldn't necessarily call it gamified.
So I think that's a great starting point to define scenario-based learning. And as I can see, there are quite a few different types. Let's get into that. You also talked about stories. So are you saying stories will be part of all scenario-based learning by default?
Story can be a pretty broad thing, but I do think that stories do tend to have characters and concrete details and conflicts and things that happen, actions that people take and consequences for those actions. Stories have all of those elements, right? They have characters and conflict and consequences and a little bit of context. A story doesn't have to be long, right? A one sentence story can still be a story. It doesn't necessarily have a beginning, middle, and an end, but I think there are, I would be hard pressed to think of something that would be scenario-based learning that doesn't have some sort of story. I guess software simulations might not have a story to go with them. A software simulation where it's just you click this, you click that, you click that, I might not call scenario-based learning. A software simulation where you're the project manager working on a project, you've got this project management tool, and one person is sick and you've got to figure out how to juggle your other resources to do it. That is a story. And that I would call scenario-based learning, and under that a simulation. Does that help in differentiating?
Absolutely. And I think it kind of, brings out the critical difference between a non-story based simulation versus a story based scenario as a effective ingredient for some of these. And what I'm picking from what you're saying is it needs to have a situation, it needs to have some decision making. Maybe it will have something else, but we'll hear from you. Excellent. And you talked about mini scenarios, which is kind of single question or multiple choice questions, but framed as scenarios.
Yeah, so that does tend to be for all that I blog a lot about branching scenarios, in practice working with clients, especially if they've never done any scenario-based learning, I don't generally start with, hey, let's do a 10-minute 100 passage or 100 slide branching scenario. Like that's not the entry point for most organizations. Because that's a little scary. This whole like non-linear content thing is a little scary for me to get organizations to do. I can almost always convince an organization that, hey, that multiple choice quiz that you've been doing, why don't we make some of these multiple choice questions scenario questions instead? We'll do a little mini scenario where we put people in a situation, we give them a 2-sentence, 3-sentence scenario to set up, and then ask them a decision to make. And so almost always I can convince a client to do that, right? Organizations, that's a good way to get past some resistance on scenario-based learning. And it increases the impact for the assessment because instead of just having the multiple choice question of, I'm training doctors on how to talk to patients, and it's, what type of, skill for motivational interviewing will elicit more, longer answers from your patient, open-ended questions, reflections, affirmations, or summaries. So like that's a typical multiple choice question, right? And it's can you remember the thing we talked about 5 minutes ago? Right? It's that memory, maybe comprehension. Instead, it can be you're working with a patient. This is their situation. This is a little bit about their patient. How do you start the conversation about trying to get them to make changes to their diet to manage their diabetes better. What question do you ask first? And then have a couple of questions. Then they have to know that, oh, right, an open-ended question is the one that I'm supposed to start with to open the conversation. I have to know that that's what it is, and I have to apply to recognize which one of these questions is an open-ended question. And I have to do it in context. That's decision-making practice. We've now really increased the impact for that assessment question or that practice question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's very important, especially for any design folks that are listening to this, that even with simple multiple choice questions, we can increase impact if we were to choose to present some sort of a decision making in context. All right. And you talked about gamification,
Mhm.
uh, and this is something you I think refer to that. Maybe I'm trying to put it in my words, which is gamification doesn't have to necessarily have badges and scores of different kind. Gamification could
Mhm.
just have the core elements, and which could happen through scenario based learning, especially brand scenarios. If you are kind of moving up some sort of a level or complexity, maybe it is already gamified, we're just not calling it gamified. So it could be an
Right.
inherent part without the frills, if I can say.
Yeah, I think Karl Kopp is, of course, the guru for games for learning. And one of the things in a lot of his writing and work is talking about that, yes, the points, badges, and leaderboards does tend to be what people think when we talk about gamification. Um, and there's a place for those things. But they tend to be the external things. The things that make a lot of games effective, when you look at a really popular big name game, a Halo or a Mass Effect or something, like the story is part of that. Having a character that you control and you make decisions and you do things that affect your environment, those are all elements of games too. The way that you decide things for the elements of like, how do you word your choices, right? Do you word your choices where you're just asking somebody a question and asking them to tell you something, or are they doing something?
Yeah.
That's a piece from game design that we can take. And I do think that it's helpful to look at games and to do that, but a lot of the interactive fiction and independent game development kind of world, there is a lot of, interactive fiction is all branching scenarios. It's just for fiction rather than for training purposes. But there's plenty of that we can use some of their ideas about what works. Like I play a game called Forge of Empires, which is, it's like a city building and battle game. One of the things that in that game is that, you do things and you get lots of feedback, right? You take actions, you build things, but there's feedback built into it, right? You do a battle and you either win or lose, and that's a consequence, and that's feedback. You build things and then you run out of space, and therefore you realize that your building strategy is not right. There's stuff that happens. Games are really good about giving constant feedback. And yes, there's things like, how many coins have I collected, and where's my ranking, and where is my guild ranked, and there's all of those things that are part of the game too. But also there's plenty of things in it that are feedback in the game that are not just explicitly, yes, there's a leaderboard. And there is a leaderboard, and there are numeric things, but there's also a lot of feedback. And that's when we think about how we show what happens after a decision, right? So often in e-learning, traditionally, people do a question and the answer is, sorry, that's incorrect, right? We do a lot of that. And I've seen that in even with scenarios, but you could do that one question mini scenario even, um, and still show a little bit of consequences of, if you're the doctor talking to the patient and you ask a yes or no question, you can, in, 2 sentences say, the patient gives you a one-word answer of no, and then you realize that you should have actually asked an open-ended question, right? You give a little bit of, you can give it a little instructional feedback too, right? Sometimes you do need, that's not to say that we never do instructional feedback and explicitly say things. We do need to do that, but we also can put it in context and we can show a little of the consequence.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So, Christy, you may have already browsed this, but let's see, why should we really using scenario-based learning? As in, how can we really link it to impact? Or how is it really better suited to achieving learning impact? Because this is something that is probably more in control of designers. And if they are able to do this, they may be contributing a lot more to achieving better impact with learning than they currently do, maybe.
One thing that is nearly universal in training is that there is a benefit to having practice with feedback. That's one of the things that we know is really effective across a wide range of learning environments, across a wide range of audiences, for a wide range of skills, is that having the opportunity to practice skills and to get feedback so that you can improve makes a big difference in the impact of learning. Practice with feedback is one of the things that we don't do a ton of in training, either instructor-based training or e-learning. We tend to do a lot more information sharing. We tend to assess comprehension. We don't necessarily do a ton of practice with feedback to help people get better. And so scenario-based learning is one of the things that can help fill that gap, to give you the opportunities to practice decision-making, to practice applying a skill in context. We know from the research that practicing skills in a more, the more similar the context is that you practice in, generally the better off you are at being able to do it in whatever your real world environment is. And for the most part, what matters more is having it be cognitively similar, having to make similar decisions. And so it's the what's going on in your head, not necessarily the multimedia piece of it, although that can help too, right? Having things that are visual cues definitely do make a difference in helping with transfer. All of that can help. It's not, we shouldn't ignore it, but we should also think primarily about what the decisions are. So those are ways that we can increase, anytime we can provide more practice opportunities, we're increasing the impact of our learning. Anytime we do practice with good feedback. Again, reiterating the point, sorry that's incorrect is not actually particularly constructive feedback. It is the bare minimum. It doesn't help if you got it incorrect because you had a misconception. Sorry that's incorrect does not help correct that misconception.
Yep.
So specific feedback in whatever form that takes, and there's a lot of different ways that we can provide feedback in scenario-based learning through, expressions and coaching and things that happen in the environment, or, an image changing, points, some, you're doing the project management and you have a tally of the cost of the project and the days to complete the project, right? You can do all of those things. And all of those are feedback. But all of that helps improve the impact, because practicing it and getting feedback on what do you need to adjust to do better, that's how we improve on pretty much any skill.
Yeah. Practice, of course, is something that most training really lacks. Feedback is really the missed opportunity in most cases.
Absolutely.
Do you also think that scenario-based learning can bring in higher level of learner involvement? Because other kind of training, which is not this, is really not engaging the learner because it may not be seemingly as relevant. It doesn't give them something meaningful to do. They can't see whether they are succeeding or not, whether they are learning or not, in fact. And I think most adults can get this almost intuitively.
Right. Right. So having things that are meaningful, right? Meaningful and motivating, right? These are great things for us to be looking for. So yes, having the scenarios, having them be relevant, having them be realistic scenarios, generally, there are exceptions for doing fantasy things, but for right now, let's focus on the, realistic scenarios and real things. So we can do higher level thinking skills. I know engagement is sort of an overdone word in the L&D world, but it is a thing that we're looking for, right? We want people to be engaged. When we think about engagement, there are 3 levels of engagement. There is the behavioral engagement of, are people clicking? Are they playing the video? Do they stop partway through the video? Do they multitask do they start the e-learning playing and then multitask and check email while they're doing it? Those are measures of behavioral engagement. We pay attention a lot to clicking and behavioral engagement. But there is also cognitive engagement and emotional or affective engagement. So the cognitive is, how deeply are you thinking about things? And how is your decision making, right? What strategies are you using to think through and have decision making? So again, even the one question mini scenarios can get you to higher levels of cognitive engagement. There is also the question of affective or emotional engagement. But anytime we have a story and we have some stakes to what's happening, right? You're the doctor with the patient, and there are stakes to helping that patient. If it's the ER doctor, there's very high stakes within that environment, and you care, there's emotions connected to that. Even if we're talking about, say, project management, there is stress of having the project go off the rails. If we're talking about customer service, you're dealing with the angry customer and trying to de-escalate a situation for conflict resolution. All of those things have some emotional impact. The question of affective engagement is also related to task values. Essentially, how much do you value the thing that you're working on? And we value things more. So, like information, you value more if you can apply it right away, rather than, I might need this someday in the future. So if you give people the information on, right, we're talking, motivational interviewing and open-ended questioning skills. If we give them a scenario, that's a reason to apply that right away. It's not just, oh, I might use this someday when I'm with a patient. It is, oh, right now I need you to make a decision about which question to ask with this simulated patient. That's a really compelling way to make things more engaging, to get people to pay attention more, to be meaningful and motivating, and to care about the training rather than just to click through.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I really like that aspect of immediate applicability because learners are really able to try it out and possibly see for themselves, whether they're
Absolutely.
getting it right or still not sure about it. Maybe they know a little bit, but not able to still make decisions. So a little more practice will make them more confident. So they are open to that and willing to commit their time and energy on it going forward. Hmm.
Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. Christy, if I could ask you, in your opinion, of course, you've worked on so many different projects. What makes good scenario-based learning? What are the things that designers should be really focusing and not missing out?
So I would say that one of the things is that you have the audience right.
Mhm.
You are targeting things correctly to your audience. You know who those learners are, and that the decisions that you are practicing are aligned with what that audience needs to do and aligned with whatever your learning objectives are. I often find that when I'm teaching people how to do branching scenarios, that initially they try to have too many learning objectives or they're too broad. It does really help with scenario-based learning, with branching scenarios, or with mini scenarios, to really narrow your focus down, to really drill down on what is the behavior that we want people to do? What are the things, what do we want people to practice? What is this supposed to look like? What does it sound like, right? We can't just say people are going to provide better customer service. That's too broad. We've got to know exactly what that is. So knowing what that is so that then the scenario is realistic and relevant, the kinds of situations that come up are realistic and relevant. I think good scenario-based learning reflects the kinds of mistakes and misconceptions people actually have. Well, it is fun to sometimes throw in the really bad example for customer service. And admittedly, those often are realistic. I've worked call centers. I have talked to call centers. We've all seen like some really terrible, we've all seen terrible customer service. And so like sometimes those things are like, okay, people have to know that this is wrong, but also it's based on a real story. But having those sorts of realistic choices, having really superb scenario-based learning has wrong answers that are kind of tempting, right? Because they do relate to some sort of misconception, because people have the wrong mental model, or because there is a common misunderstanding. And so, part of your analysis and planning, especially if you're doing a bigger branching scenario or a simulation, but even for the one question mini scenarios, you want your distractors to reflect the kind of mistakes that people might actually make, so then you can show the consequences or show the feedback and help people recognize, oh, wait, I guess I didn't actually understand that, right? It's so easy for us to listen to a lecture or watch somebody else do something, and we feel like, oh yeah, I can do that, right? This is Bandura's four factors for improving self-efficacy. Vicarious experience of watching somebody else do something improves your self-efficacy. It's you watch the YouTube video and you're like, oh, I can do that. And then you go try it yourself, like, oh, wait a second. Never mind. Like that was harder in practice. And that's that difference, right? Where it is the question of the vicarious experience of showing somebody, yes, showing somebody and giving them a worked example, that is a good strategy, but also the mastery experience of actually doing it successfully, making those correct decisions also improves that self-efficacy, the confidence with it. Those are all things that help make really good scenario-based learning.
Okay, so the initial part, so I could, bucket them into two main things. One is great analysis to get the audience right and the kind of decisions and things they are supposed to do in their environment. And second is to also identify the misconceptions. That is what we are really trying to address, and probably those become your options. So you end up making those mistakes, and this is what we are trying to do, is get you to make those mistakes in a safe environment and also to correct your misconceptions by giving you good feedback.
Yes, absolutely. All of that has to be part of your analysis. You can't just, when you talk to a SME and interview them, or you're doing your research, it's not enough to say, well, what is this supposed to look like, right? And to show the right way. That's too often in e-learning and in training, we just show the right way. We don't figure out where people get off track.
Right.
And so your analysis has to include, well, where do people get stuck in this process? Where do people make mistakes? What was confusing to you when you first learned this?
Yeah.
What are people doing wrong? When are they doing it wrong? Is there a situation in which they're doing it wrong? All of that is part of the analysis process when you're doing scenario-based learning. And then you have a much more complete picture of what's going on in that environment and why it isn't working. And again, if we want the impact to be, what's the behavior we're trying to change? That's the impact, right? We want some behavior to change. It's hard to change that behavior if we don't know what the mistakes are that people are doing right now. And so this does force you to do that part of the analysis. And it is hard to create plausible distractors. Like that is a challenge. Even I, like as many of these things as I have done, coming up with good plausible distractors in questions is a hard task. Doing that analysis first does help. I will say I am using, AI to help brainstorm some of these things. There is, especially if you're talking about more common tasks, you can do some of the, if you can't get good answers from the SME, something of the like, well, what are things that people often do wrong in conflict resolution at work, right? And you can use those things, or you can help guide the AI to help with the brainstorming. You're still going to have to validate it. It's still, AI is not a substitute for doing analysis. But I think it can help you with the brainstorming. I like it for the brainstorming and for drafting. Never use AI without having an actual human being check it. Don't like all of those things still apply to. Like use the AI to help you. Do not let it do your job for you. It's not good enough.
That's an important caveat. But yeah, I mean, there's something in that. If you say, AI can help you give some of those things like misconceptions, maybe it gives you a good starting point to go to the SME and have discussion with, because sometimes SMEs will have this information quite locked and they can't really
Mhm.
give it to you, very easy. Not that they don't want to, it's just that they can't access it themselves. So
Absolutely.
so
Yeah.
if we come up with, maybe some of them are not so great
Right.
misconceptions, but at least they can clarify, oh, yes, this can be one important one. And I've seen people getting this wrong.
Yes. And actually that can be one of the ways that you do it too, is so often working with SMEs, one of the challenges is the blank page, right? Like if we give a SME a blank page and say, well, write down all of the misconceptions, it is hard for them to access it. If we have on our own through research, through AI, through going on Reddit and seeing what people complain about, which is absolutely a research technique, going on Reddit or whatever your online community is. People complain on Reddit. It's a great place to find problems.
Yeah.
Like doing those research things. And then you can go back to a SME and say, okay, here's my idea of what the misconceptions and mistakes would be. Can you validate these? Can you help me prioritize this list? And then they can absolutely do that. I think that's one of the ways it's always challenging with a SME, because yes, there's so much of that that's unconscious. The nature of being an expert is that a lot of that you chunk it all together in your head and you automate those tasks, and accessing those explicitly is really hard, but they can correct things, right? I often say that, you give the SME something knowing that it's going to be kind of wrong, but SMEs can't resist correcting you when you're wrong, right? You give it to them knowing it'll be wrong and let them fix it, because that's, if you are stuck with a SME on a branching scenario, put something down, draft something, prototype something, and show them that, because the hardest thing, it's so hard for SMEs, especially if they've never done branching scenarios before, to envision what it should really be until you do it with their content. And then yes, you can iterate, and they can point out the mistakes once it's there. But that's often one of the challenges of working with SMEs, but also the solution I have found is often give them something, try to like calm your ego and prepare yourself for the fact that they're going to come back with a whole bunch of changes. and know that you're going to get corrected a bunch, which could be kind of challenging as an ID. Like, right, you put in all that work, you do all of that stuff, you've tried so hard, and then they come back with 300 changes. So as long as you prepare yourself for the fact that, like, okay, I know that I drafted this and I know some things are going to be wrong.
But I think those are important tips. Any other ideas that you may have, especially on creating good misconceptions or those appropriate, plausible wrong answers that you may have tried?
So yeah, so with plausible wrong answer. So I often with my scenarios do tend to go for I usually have three choices. If I'm thinking specifically branching scenarios, I usually have three choices. More than that, and the complexity, it expands so much. So I generally default to three choices. I often have done a good choice, an okay choice, and a bad choice. The bad choice is often like very explicitly a mistake that we've identified, right? An okay choice can be something that is partially correct, something that is a correct answer, but at the wrong time in the process, or would be a correct answer in a different situation, but not for this situation. Those are the things also to look for plausible distractors, is the ones that are, it would be right if the situation was different. Same thing happens when we're talking about workplace training, that, oh yes, actually, project management, the strategy of getting a bunch of people and having them all work together works really well if the task is something like stuffing envelopes that everybody's going to do consistently. The project management strategy of having a bunch of people come to help does not work so well if the task is reviewing e-learning, because having 5 people review e-learning does not take 20% of the time of having one person review e-learning. It in fact increases the time, right? So it is that, right? Like knowing what strategy to apply and when, because that's often what, right? Those are the kinds of decisions we really do have to make in work, is you have a toolkit of a lot of different things. Do you pick the right one for the right situation?
Yeah.
Those make really good plausible distractors. So if you can look for those opportunities of it's kind of right. Now, Karl Kopp talks about, for his decisions, doing like a good, better, best, and really having a lot of nuance. And I think especially if you're doing advanced skills where your learners are already kind of experienced with it and you're getting into real nuance of things, I think that framework works really well if that's the right thing. If we're talking about bare novices who have never done it before, then maybe you want to not have quite so much nuance in the wording. Again, which strategy to apply depending on the situation.
Excellent. I think that's a great way to come up with plausible distractors. Trying to see part of it is right. Maybe the timing is not correct, or maybe the way it is being done or where it is being done is not right. All right, Christy, we've seen what is good. And maybe if you just reverse that, we'll probably find some of those common things that people do wrong. But are there other common pitfalls apart from not doing good analysis or some of these things that we just discussed on the good part of it? But
right. So yeah, the reverse of all of those. I will say that, so pitfalls I have seen for people. One is that the choices aren't really actions. They are, so instead of having a concrete action that somebody takes for a decision, you're sort of talking about it, right? You set up a really good scenario of you're working in the ER and there's lots of patients coming in and you have to do things. And you've got 2 different patients. Here's the 2 things. What type of triage should you do, right? Or, what type of situation is this? Where you set up a concrete scenario, but you're asking them an abstract question. That is a pitfall that's so easy to fall into because those are the types of questions that we're so used to asking that
Right.
force of habit just gets us back into like, oh, it's that question of the application, the labeling things rather than the actually applying the strategy.
Mm.
And again, there's sort of and it depends. You could potentially do something of like, well, what strategy are you going to use, and then follow it up with how do you apply that strategy? Maybe there's a way to do it with like, yes, you have to decide which thing you're going to use, but still, generally speaking, we want to jump into like the actions as much as possible because those are the decisions that we want people to practice to get feedback on. Another pitfall I have seen people do is not keeping the perspective consistent throughout a whole scenario.
Mhm.
So, for example, you start out with like one main character and that's whose decisions you're making. And then all of a sudden it switches and it's, well, now it's the other person that
Mhm.
you were talking to, and what do they say back in response?
Mm.
There are ways to make that work, but it's much more complex, and I think it fails more often than it succeeds. You have to be really deliberate and plan it. I've seen it for there's a good game. What is it? Hannah Speaks or something that was it is all centered around the conversations that one teenage girl has with a bunch of people around her. And in that one you shift perspective just like an author might shift the perspective from chapter to chapter. It's written in that way and it's a larger scope. In shorter branching scenarios that we tend to do for training, it tends to just be jarring and kind of mess up the context. And if you've tried to align, your protagonist should generally be in a similar kind of role to your audience, right? This is that audience analysis. So if you're switching who's doing the action, are you still aligned with your audience? And not always. And I've seen several of those in samples that I've reviewed for people or in teaching my course that I've seen that one come up. Where again, thinking about your perspective and keeping it aligned all the way through. I think that not aligning the structure, if we're doing branching scenarios in particular, there's also a pitfall of not aligning the structure to your learning objectives. So what I mean is, so if we're teaching customer service and we want to show how to de-escalate in a bunch of different situations, so you're going to have one customer and then a second customer and then a third customer so that you can show different types of situations because that's the important skill. So then the branching structure should have one customer, you branch out a little bit in that conversation, and then you should bottleneck back to start the second conversation. What happens with the second customer is basically a brand new situation. It's not, doesn't reflect what you did with the first customer, right? And then we should come back down. That means that the structure of the branching scenario aligns with the objectives of what we're trying to accomplish.
Mm.
That's a trickier skill to learn, and I think that again is a skill that needs to be practiced for instructional designers. But I think it is something that I see people do. Sometimes people will do, just kind of the gauntlet structure of that constrained scenario or more linear scenario where you have one question, you get some feedback, you are immediately back on the path. Kathy Moore calls those control freak scenarios because you as the instructional designer are controlling everything. The learner has the illusion of control without actually controlling anything. Those have a place. I've used, right? If we're trying to train a brand new skill, having it be friendly and having there be no way to fail and we immediately put people back on the right path. There are times to use those, but we should use them when it aligns with our goals, not just say, well, we should never actually do extensive branching because it's too complex and why bother? right? We should always just pretend. We should just always have it be a gauntlet and a looping. And you decide that's your structure before you've even talked about what your objectives are.
All right. Okay. So, three big pitfalls. One is making choices very simple or not action oriented, and kind of giving away all the hard work that you do in crafting the scenario. And it could also be that crafting the scenario is easier than crafting, plausible distractors and better options, where you have to also give feedback, consequential feedback, etc. Right? Not keeping the perspective consistent and not aligning structure to the learning objectives. To the third one, uh, how do you decide on what is the length of the scenario? Length, I mean, how many practice scenarios do you need for a particular learning objective? And also, do you tend to bring in spacing within that?
So this is something of the, there is certainly a real factor of what are the resources you have, what's the time, what's the budget? Because there really is, right, the complexity of a branching scenario really can expand a lot very quickly. And so in practice, there is a lot of that is driven by the resources, right? Have worked with an agency that did a lot of interactive video scenarios. And I've literally had cases where it's like, okay, we have budget. We have a half day of having actors. We have budget to record a maximum of 15 videos. So you have to write your branching scenario to fit 15 videos of a max of 2 minutes each, because because that's how long we're going to have the actors and this location. And we got to be able to get it done in a half day of shooting. So if that's what you are working with, then it's going to be a short scenario with a lot of reusing choices, right? And in practice, I will say that there is more of that than we might have in an ideal world. But it's okay, because having those constraints then makes you be creative, right? It makes you really, like, if it's okay, I've got 15 videos, I got to make every one of these really count. I have to make every decision. There's no throwaway choices. So it does force you then to edit down. I think that in the instructional design answer of that, rather than the project manager consultant working with organizations' budgets answer, is that we look at, okay, this skill that we are trying to practice, how many steps are there in this skill? Right? Where, Kathy Moore has written that, 7 decisions in the ideal path tends to be about kind of where she targets. If we're talking about a 5-step process, we're not going to have 7 decisions, right? So I think that rather than, that's a nice kind of target benchmark to have in mind, but it also, again, we should align things to our learning objectives. If we've gotten our learning objective, we've really narrowed down, we focused in on this is the specific behavior we want. So if we figure out, okay, if somebody did this behavior perfectly, what would it look like? Now let's break that down into steps. So again, let's say that this process has 5 steps. Well, then we're probably going to have decisions at each of those 5 things. We'll have some branching off and coming back, and we'll decide from there. If the process has 10 steps, then we have some more decisions to make. One of the students in the last cohort of my Build Your Branching Scenario course had a process that was more like 9 or 10 steps. So then we have to decide, okay, are all 10 of those steps really critical for us to practice? Can we, because that's a really big scenario. And then we're kind of balancing the resources and the how much time are you going to do and how much time do your learners have to do this? So, out of those 10 decisions, can we narrow this down to like 7? Are there 3 of them that people pretty much get right all the time? Okay, if there's 3 of those 10 steps that people aren't having trouble with, let's show those at the right place in the process, but not actually have them branch out and have them be decisions, right? We're going to do a cut scene. We're stealing from game development again. We're going to do a cut scene where a cut scene in a movie is you're not making decisions, you're just seeing the video of it happening to move the plot along. We're going to do a cut scene to show that part of the process because learners don't actually need it. And again, this is the aligning the structure to your objectives and what the learners need. And that's another way to do that. So I think it really is a logistically, how much time do you have? Because a branching scenario development can fill whatever time you have available. And so you've got to make some decisions to, figure out, okay, realistically, like, what are we going to do? And the good news is I think that short branching scenarios are actually very effective, right? A 5-minute branching scenario activity, if it's just text on the screen and you're not listening to audio, that can actually make quite a few decisions that you are making a choice and getting feedback. And that can be very effective as a 5 or 10-minute activity. I hardly ever have something that's longer than a 10-minute activity as a branching scenario. At that point, the complexity is such that you probably are better off doing a series of smaller scenarios. That also tends to be part of my strategy for like keeping things manageable and not having the structure explode forever and ever, right? Do a series of smaller scenarios. Again, narrow your focus, really narrow your objective, and make a couple of different scenarios to build skills over time and build them up, rather than one ginormous scenario to do everything.
Yeah, I think bigger scenarios could also be a big problem. One in development, at the same time, also with feedback as you go to, SMEs and other people who try it out because they can't see all the branches always. And so they can't really get their head around what all is possible in this, who's going to see what, etc., what experience they're going to have, etc. So it could be. So when you say, short ones with just text on screen, I was thinking about Short Sims, the book that
Yeah.
Paul written. Something like that would be more appropriate. If you have a larger thing, just break it into pieces and probably link them up.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely pieces of Clark Aldrich's short Sims approach that I definitely use it. Everybody's got their own twist on it, but there's pieces of that that are good. And yeah, he talks about that, he has he does 3-minute Sims, or he does like 6 to 8 minutes of Sim, or whatever his things are. And he's I think done the best in the field at making this a repeatable process, right? Like narrowing down, like he's got these visual styles, you have this style of simulations. Here are the things. He really limits how much review is happening so that he can turn them around in a couple of weeks. Because the reviews are the other place that branching scenarios tend to get off track. And yes, the more complex your scenario is, the trickier it is to get SME reviews.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. I think we've covered quite a lot. Is there any other advice that you would have for people who are trying to create good scenario-based learning, which we may not have covered?
Yeah. So I think if you're just getting started with scenario-based learning, I would say start with those 1-question mini scenarios. They really are good practice for writing concisely, getting a scenario, and getting choices that matter. That's the place to start. And again, if you have some resistance to overcome, that's the way to do it. And then when you've got it and you've got some results, and you can say, okay, well, now let's try something a little bit more complicated. The other thing that I see for people, if they're just getting started, the other 2 pitfalls that I see is people trying to do something way too big for their very first scenario. Start small, practice this. Like anything else, this is a skill that requires practice. You can learn it. you absolutely can learn it, but you do have to practice. So in the same way that you would scaffold things if you were having learners do this, scaffold your own practice and, like do things and have some supports and start small before jumping right in. And, don't and do take some time. I do think it's helpful for people to plan out the structure somewhat first rather than just starting in and writing. That's another thing where it's that pitfall I didn't mention earlier. But when I see people, especially at the beginning, if you sit down to write without having mapped out the structure, that's a place where I see people get stuck and have a harder time recovering from. With practice, I will say for myself right now, I do often, I have my planning, I have a design document, I have information on the story and the characters and the mistakes. I do tend to just sit down and write, but I can see the structure in my head because I've done a bunch of these. That's not where you start out, right? You start out by planning some structure. So when you're just getting started, take some time to map out that structure and think about how you're going to branch, and so that you don't get off into some path that goes on for too long and then you have to figure out how to recover from it. It's way too easy to get off on those, and planning first will help you avoid getting stuck and getting overwhelmed and frustrated, which is very easy to do with branching scenarios when you're first learning them.
Excellent points. And of course, you can do it because you are an expert, and that's how experts work. And people who are beginning, they should be following the process till they become more comfortable thinking about the structure in their heads. Thank you so much, Christy. This has been wonderful. A lot of insightful stuff here. I'm sure our audience will learn. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me. This has been a great discussion. It's a great meaty questions to dig into today.
Thank you.